So you want to learn how to solder copper pipe, but every joint you make ends up leaking or looking like a mess. You are not alone. And the good news is these problems are completely avoidable once you know what to watch for. After 3 decades of sweating copper joints, I have seen every mistake in the book. Today, I am walking you through 8 fatal errors that beginners make when soldering copper pipe. And stick around for number 6 because it could actually get you in legal trouble. Plus, I have a bonus tip at the end that professionals swear by. The first mistake that ruins more solder joints than any other is skipping pipe and fitting prep. I cannot stress this enough. If you take nothing else away from this video, remember that proper preparation is the foundation of every successful solder joint. When you skip this step, you are almost guaranteeing yourself a leak. Here is what happens when you try to solder dirty copper. The flux cannot do its job properly because it is fighting against dirt, oil, oxidation, and debris. The solder will not bond to the copper surface the way it needs to, and you end up with weak spots and gaps that turn into drips the moment you turn the water back on. So let me walk you through the right way to prep your pipe and fittings. First, after you cut your copper pipe to length, you need to deburr the inside edge. Use a deburring tool or even the back edge of your tube cutter, if it has one. Those little burrs and rough spots inside the pipe might seem harmless, but they restrict water flow and create turbulence that can actually wear away at your pipe walls over time. Next, you need to clean the outside of the pipe end. Grab some plumber's sandcloth or an abrasive mesh pad and polish that copper until it shines like a new penny. You want to clean about an inch or so beyond where the fitting will sit. I like to wrap the sandcloth around the pipe and twist it back and forth until I see that bright copper color. Now here is the part many beginners forget. You also need to clean the inside of your fitting. Use a fitting brush that matches your pipe size and give the inside of that fitting a good scrubbing. Every surface that will come into contact with solder needs to be clean and shiny. No exceptions. Trust me, taking an extra 2 or 3 minutes to prep properly will save you hours of frustration and potential water damage down the road. The second fatal mistake is trying to solder with water still in the line. This one drives beginners absolutely crazy because they do everything else right, but the solder just will not flow properly. Here is the science behind it. When you apply heat to a pipe that has water inside, most of that heat energy goes into turning the water into steam instead of heating the copper to the right temperature. The flux burns off before the pipe gets hot enough, and the solder just balls up and falls off instead of flowing into the joint. Even a tiny trickle of water can completely sabotage your work. So, how do you deal with this? First, make sure you have properly shut off the water supply and open faucets at the highest and lowest points in your system to drain it completely. Sometimes water gets trapped in low spots, so be patient and let gravity do its work. But here is the reality. Sometimes you cannot get every last dropout, especially on repair jobs in older homes where the shutoff valves do not seal perfectly anymore. When that happens, there is an old plumber trick that has saved countless jobs. Take a piece of plain white bread, not wheat, just regular soft white bread, and tear off a small piece. Roll it into a tight ball and stuff it into the pipe a few inches back from where you need to solder. The bread acts as a temporary dam that absorbs the water and holds it back long enough for you to complete your joint. Once you turn the water back on and open the faucet, the bread dissolves and flushes right out. Just make sure to remove your faucet aerators first so the bread particles do not clog them. For bigger jobs or when you have more water flow to deal with, there are tools called jet sweats that use expandable rubber plugs to create a watertight seal inside the pipe. They cost a bit more, but they are reusable and work like a charm. The bottom line is this: never try to fight against water. Either get the pipe completely dry or use one of these tricks to block the moisture temporarily. The third mistake on our list is using too much or too little flux. Flux is that paste you apply to the pipe and fitting before soldering, and it serves two critical purposes. It cleans any remaining oxidation from the copper surface, and it helps the molten solder flow smoothly into the joint through capillary action. The problem is that many beginners think if a little flux is good, a whole lot must be better. That is simply not true, and using too much flux can actually destroy your pipes over time. When excess flux gets heated, it becomes acidic. That acid travels inside your pipe and causes a chemical reaction that creates something called verdigris. You have seen verdigris before, even if you did not know the name. It is that greenish-blue coating you see on old pennies or the Statue of Liberty. On your copper pipes, verdigris eats away at the metal and causes pitting that leads to pinhole leaks years down the road. On the other hand, using too little flux creates its own problems. If you do not apply enough flux or if you miss spots, the solder will not flow evenly around the entire joint. You end up with gaps and voids that become leak paths. So what is the right amount? You want a thin, even coating on both the outside of the pipe end and the inside of the fitting. I recommend using a small acid brush to apply the flux. Dip the brush in and spread a consistent layer that covers the surface without globs or thick spots. If you see excess flux squeezing out when you push the pipe into the fitting, you have used too much. Wipe away the excess before you start heating. One more tip here. Make sure you're using the right type of flux for your application. For potable water systems, you want a flux that is approved for drinking water. Water-soluble flux is easier to clean up afterward, while tinning flux contains tiny particles of solder that help beginners get better results on tricky joints. Now, if you're finding this video helpful so far, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps this video reach more homeowners like yourself who would also find this information helpful. All right, let's continue. The fourth mistake that trips up almost every beginner is heating the solder instead of the fitting. This is one of those errors that seems logical at first, but goes against how soldering actually works. When you touch your solder wire directly to the flame or to the hottest part of the pipe, the solder melts into a blob and just sits there or falls off. It does not flow into the joint the way it should. Here is what you need to understand. Soldering copper pipe relies on something called capillary action. This is a natural tendency of liquid to flow into tight spaces when conditions are right. When you heat the fitting and pipe evenly, the solder gets drawn into the tiny gap between the pipe and fitting almost like magic. The solder actually chases the heat, flowing toward the hottest part of the joint. So the proper technique is to heat the fitting, not the solder. Position your torch flame on the fitting, specifically on the cup portion where the pipe slides in. Move the flame around the fitting to heat it evenly on all sides. After several seconds of heating, touch your solder wire to the joint on the opposite side from where the flame is pointing. If the copper is hot enough, the solder will melt immediately on contact and get pulled right into the joint. If the solder does not melt when it touches the copper, the fitting is not hot enough yet. Keep heating for a few more seconds and try again. Never hold the torch flame directly on the solder wire. That just creates messy blobs that do not seal anything. One helpful trick is to watch the flux as you heat the joint. When the flux starts to bubble and sizzle, you are getting close to the right temperature. When it goes quiet and the copper takes on a slightly different sheen, that is usually the sweet spot for applying your solder. With practice, you will develop a feel for the timing. The key is patience. Let the heat do the work, and let capillary action pull the solder exactly where it needs to go. The fifth fatal mistake involves overheating or underheating the joint. Temperature control is everything when it comes to soldering copper, and finding that perfect middle ground takes some practice. Both extremes will ruin your work in different ways. When you underheat the joint, the solder simply will not flow. It sits on the surface in lumpy beads instead of getting drawn into the gap between the pipe and fitting. You might be tempted to just keep adding more solder, thinking that will solve the problem. It will not. You will just end up with a crusty mess on the outside while the inside of the joint remains unsealed. Underheated joints leak because the solder never actually penetrated where it needed to go. Overheating is equally destructive, but in different ways. When you apply too much heat for too long, several bad things happen. First, you burn off all the flux before the solder has a chance to flow. Without flux, the solder cannot bond properly to the copper. Second, excessive heat can actually damage the copper itself, making it brittle or discolored. You will notice the pipe turning dark or even black when it gets too hot. Third, overheated solder becomes too runny and tends to drip right through the joint instead of filling it properly. The type of flame you use matters too. A concentrated, pointed flame can create hot spots that burn one area while leaving another area too cool. Many professionals prefer a softer, more spread out flame that wraps around the fitting and heats everything more evenly. If your torch has adjustable settings, experiment with a medium flame rather than cranking it all the way up. The goal is to bring the entire joint up to soldering temperature at roughly the same time. For most lead-free solders used in plumbing today, you are looking for the copper to reach somewhere between 420 and 460 degrees Fahrenheit. You will not be measuring this with a thermometer, but with experience you will learn to read the visual cues, the flux behavior, the color of the copper, and the way the solder responds will tell you everything you need to know. The sixth mistake on our list is using the wrong type of solder, and this one can get you into serious trouble. Back in the old days, plumbers commonly used 50-50 tin and lead solder because it was easy to work with and flowed beautifully. But here is the thing. Lead solder has been banned for potable water systems in the United States since 1986. Using lead solder on any pipe that carries drinking water is not just a bad idea. It is actually illegal. The Safe Drinking Water Act prohibits it, and for good reason. Lead is toxic and can leach into your water supply, posing serious health risks, especially for children and pregnant women. The problem is that lead solder is still sold in hardware stores because it has legitimate uses for non-potable applications like certain types of metalwork or closed-loop heating systems. If you grab the wrong spool off the shelf, you might not realize your mistake until an inspector fails your work or worse. Always check the label before you buy. Your solder should clearly state that it is lead-free and safe for potable water. Look for products that meet the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act and are certified to NSF 61 standards. Common lead-free solders contain combinations of tin, copper, silver, antimony, or bismuth. The two most popular formulations you will find are 95-5, which is 95% tin, and 5% antimony, and solders containing a small amount of silver for better flow characteristics. Lead-free solder does behave a bit differently than the old lead-based stuff. It requires slightly higher temperatures and has a narrower working window, meaning it goes from solid to liquid more quickly. This is one reason why beginners who learn on lead solder sometimes struggle with the newer materials. The key is to work a bit faster and make sure your joint is fully prepped and ready before you start heating. Also be aware that electrical solder is completely different from plumbing solder. Even if the alloy seems similar, electrical solder is not approved for drinking water and often contains flux cores that are unsuitable for plumbing applications. The seventh mistake that catches beginners off guard is skipping the post-solder cleanup. Once you see that solder flow beautifully around your joint, it is tempting to consider the job done and move on. But there is one more critical step that many people skip, and ignoring it can come back to haunt you years later. Remember that flux we talked about earlier? The stuff that helps clean the copper and makes the solder flow. Well, that flux becomes corrosive when heated, and any residue left on your pipe will continue to attack the copper over time. This is what causes that greenish-blue discoloration called verdigris that I mentioned before. Left unchecked, flux residue eats away at your beautiful new joint and can eventually cause pinhole leaks that seem to appear out of nowhere. The solution is simple but requires you to act while the joint is still warm. Immediately after the solder has flowed and you have removed the torch, grab a damp rag and wipe down the entire joint. This removes the excess flux while it is still soft and easy to clean. Be careful because the pipe is hot. So use a rag that is wet enough to protect your fingers, but not so wet that it shocks the joint with cold water. After the first wipe, follow up with a dry cloth to remove any remaining residue and moisture. This leaves you with a clean, professional-looking joint that will last for decades. Some plumbers like to lightly buff the cooled joint with sand cloth afterward to remove any discoloration from the heat. This step is purely cosmetic and does not affect the function of the joint, but it does give your work that polished, professional appearance. If you're working on exposed pipes where appearance matters, it is worth the extra 30 seconds. The habit of cleaning your joints immediately after soldering also gives you a chance to inspect your work while everything is fresh. Look for any gaps, pinholes, or areas where the solder did not flow completely around the joint. The eighth and final mistake on our list is moving the joint before it cools. After all the careful preparation, proper heating, and watching that solder flow perfectly into place, the last thing you want to do is ruin everything in the final seconds. But that is exactly what happens when impatient beginners grab the pipe or fitting before the solder has fully solidified. Here is the problem. Solder does not go from liquid to solid instantly. There's a transitional phase where it looks solid on the surface, but is still somewhat plastic underneath. If you bump, twist, or put pressure on the joint during this critical cooling period, you can create tiny cracks in the solder that become leak paths. These cracks might not show up immediately. The joint might even pass a pressure test right after you finish. But over time, as the pipe expands and contracts with temperature changes and water pressure fluctuates, those microscopic fractures open up, and you end up with a slow drip that drives you crazy trying to find. The fix for this mistake is the easiest one in this entire video. Just leave the joint alone and let it cool naturally. This typically takes about 30 to 60 seconds, depending on the size of the pipe and the ambient temperature. I know it is hard to be patient when you're eager to test your work or move on to the next joint, but those few seconds of waiting are critical. If you need to speed up the cooling process slightly, you can gently apply a damp rag to the pipe a few inches away from the joint. This draws heat away without shocking the solder itself. Never spray cold water directly on a freshly soldered joint, as the rapid temperature change can stress the metal and weaken the bond. Once the joint has cooled enough that you can touch the pipe comfortably a few inches away, it is safe to handle. At that point, you can test for leaks by turning the water back on slowly and watching the joint carefully for any drips or weeping. And now for the bonus tip that professional plumbers swear by. If you are struggling to get consistent results with lead-free solder, try switching to a tinning flux instead of regular flux. Tinning flux contains tiny particles of powdered solder mixed right into the paste. When you apply it and heat the joint, those particles melt first and coat the copper surface with a thin layer of solder. This process is called pre-tinning, and it does two important things for you. First, it protects the copper from oxidizing during that critical window between when the flux burns off and when your solder arrives. Second, it gives the incoming solder something to bond with immediately, resulting in better flow and stronger joints. Tinning flux is especially helpful on larger diameter pipes, vertical joints, or any situation where you are working in awkward positions. Many professional plumbers keep it in their toolbox, specifically for tricky situations. It costs a little more than regular flux, but the improvement in results is worth every penny, especially when you are learning. Thanks for sticking with me through the entire video. If you found this helpful, give it a like, subscribe for more DIY plumbing tips, and check out our other videos.